receive a notification here about recording. So I went ahead and I have muted everybody and turned off everybody's camera for them. But just some housekeeping for you all. Thank you for joining us this evening. Just to make this Zoom experience a little enjoyable for everyone, please be sure your microphone is on mute. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat box and we will answer at each of the end of each of the presentations, or if you've got questions along the way, we'll both kind of be watching that and then we'll ask the presenter those questions. Finally, this session will be recorded and shared on YouTube. So if you do not want to be seen, please turn off your cameras. But like I said, I've gone ahead and went and turned everybody's camera off for them. And then finally, the information within this class is for educational purposes only. Reference to any commercial products or trade names does not imply endorsement by UT Extension or bias against those not mentioned. And I will go ahead and introduce myself. I am Elizabeth Renfro. I am the Family Consumer Science Extension Agent for UT Extension, Washington County. With me this evening is Adam Watson, and I'll let him introduce himself here in a few moments when I hand it over. But this is actually our last Garden to Table series class, the Salsa Garden, for this season. So hopefully we'll be able to partner up again and offer it either well, maybe a couple in the fall, or, and of course, again, maybe next spring to help jumpstart everybody. But I am going to hand it over to Adam.
All right. Thank you, Elizabeth, and welcome to everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Adam Watson. I am one of two agriculture agents we have in Washington County, and just like to say thank you for joining us. And so today, what I will be presenting to you is a little bit of salsa gardening. And so, of course, as you might guess, one of the features of tonight is going to be tomatoes. You can see there on the front screen. But as we go through this, I hope to just point out a few things to you and talk about one common problem that I get calls about during the growing season. I hope that's helpful to go into that some depth. We've already seen about no endorsement. So I did want to mention one herb this evening that you can grow in your gardens that directly applies to salsa, and that would be cilantro or coriander. So we actually get a 2-for-1 out of this plant. Whenever we're growing it just for the young leaves and using those in our cooking, it's cilantro. But if we're actually using the seed, then it's coriander. And so this is actually a plant that is a member of the same family as parsley and carrots. So we have some others in our garden that we grow related to it. It's a plant that likes full sun, well-drained soil, which really characterizes a lot of plants within our garden. One thing in particular about it, we want to make sure there's good fertility there when it's young. So maybe if we don't have the richest garden soils, we want to make a point to do fertilizer applications as they are growing, especially when young. Do take note that if you're wanting to grow cilantro, you do want to plant it successively throughout the season so that you're harvesting the young plants, the most tender. And what happens, especially as we get into summer heat, those plants will go into flower. And so you can actually allow those plants to successfully flower and set fruit, the little seed pods, because they can actually self-sow in our garden. So you can actually have a cilantro patch that creates coriander, and it's actually self-sowing those seeds in our garden. If we are particularly wanting to grow for coriander, the actual seed, you're going to want to plant a lot of it because each individual plant itself doesn't produce a large number of seeds. So just be aware of that. Of course, tonight we're going to be more focused on cilantro side of it. But just to give you an idea what it looks like, a lot of us may be familiar with cilantro as we go to Mexican restaurants. But here's what it looks like in the garden if we actually let it go to flower and then ultimately produce that seed in those fruit or seed capsules. So a little bit different look to it than we may be used to, but definitely something that can be grown well in our area. And of course, the focus, I want to talk about tomatoes and peppers. And really, tomatoes and peppers are not just the star of salsa. They're used in so many different culinary aspects. And so it's no surprise that generally those two are regarded as the most commonly grown uh, garden plants. Part of the reason is they're great to grow in the garden because they don't require large areas. So cucumbers and even things like summer squashes are also very popular, but they require a little more space. They're a little less likely to be grown successfully in a container, for instance, and so certainly tomatoes and peppers are easier to have when space is limited for you. And truthfully, when it comes right down to it, tomatoes and peppers are not very finicky. Both of them has options out there that have very good disease resistance bred into them. So they're not something that is especially hard to grow. Doesn't mean we don't need to sometimes take care with it and pay attention to what we're doing, but certainly they're not the hardest thing in the world to grow. And again, I already mentioned it, very versatile in cuisine. I'm always amazed at how many different cultures have adopted the use of both tomatoes and peppers as a significant portion of their culinary arts. So there's a few tips, and really we can apply this to pretty much anything we talk about growing. Um, Use mulch and water so that, in particular, with these two plants of peppers and tomatoes, we're trying to prevent blossom end rot. And we're going to go in depth with blossom end rot because it's something that's common and there's really some misconceptions about it. But mulch and watering more evenly is a great way to prevent blossom end rot. When we do water in the garden, we want to take care that we're actually not wetting the plant, like the foliage of the plant. And so that's why things such as soaker hoses or drip irrigation, or even just taking care if we're using a hose and a wand, or even a watering can, making sure we're not wetting the plant itself. The plants need the water in their roots, not on their above ground parts. And quite honestly, when we wet plant tissues, we are encouraging conditions that encourage disease. And so the less wet periods we have on a plant, the less likely we are to see diseases develop. So anytime we can avoid wetting that plant, we help prevent disease. So we want to avoid that whenever we're irrigating or watering. And one key thing too is roots also need air. So they do need water, but we don't want to be planting plants in poor draining areas where water is standing or where water takes a while to drain away. So one of the things we can do in the garden, if we do maybe have some areas that aren't ideal in this aspect, is to use mounded beds. Certainly we can build something more formal like a raised bed, and just that distance, that physical distance, helps improve drainage thanks to gravity. But even just mounding up soil in the garden to where it's a few to several inches higher than the surrounding area is one way to help a soil that maybe isn't the quickest to drain to be a little bit more quick draining. And so we can sometimes take advantage of less than ideal situations. When it comes to fertilizer, we do encourage folks in the home garden to look at getting a soil test maybe every 3 to 5 years. And one of the reasons we want to do that is to make sure we're providing the nutrition we need for plants. If we don't have that soil test, and there's certainly times when we are planting and it's been maybe a little while since we've had one, typically we'll focus mainly on providing nitrogen to our garden areas. And so we look at applying pre-plant before we're actually putting our garden plants in there or sowing seed. We're looking at about zero point 0.4 pounds, that's 4/10ths of a pound of actual nitrogen. So less than half a pound of actual nitrogen per 100 square feet of garden. And so the reason we are talking about actual nitrogen is whenever we look at fertilizers, fertilizers are typically we see them have those three numbers represented on a bag. A common one is 10, 10, 10, for instance, that a lot of gardeners have used or seen. Each of those numbers represents a different nutrient content. So let's say we have a fertilizer that is a 20, 21, 22. Now I did that so we can distinguish which number goes with which nutrient. So certainly don't go to the garden center and ask for a 20, 21, 22 fertilizer because they're going to look at you weird. And if you tell them I sent you, they're really going to be scratching their head. But that first number is the nitrogen content. It's percent nitrogen. So in this hypothetical fertilizer, it's 20% nitrogen. The phosphorus, which is measured as the percentage of P2O5, is actually 21% in this example, and the potassium, or also called potash commonly, is measured as K2O, and that is actually 22% in our example. And so what this means, if we were applying this fertilizer to 100 square feet to get the zero point 0.4 pounds of actual nitrogen, we had to take into account the 20% rate. So we would actually be looking at applying 2 pounds of this fertilizer to get zero point 0.4 pounds of actual nitrogen. And it goes back to 20% content. So that's why I say actual nitrogen. Depending on the fertilizer you're using, you're going to apply different amounts of it. So just be aware of how you calculate that. I do want to mention to you that in-season fertilization, or what we commonly call side dressing, is also something that's important. And particularly, I've zeroed in on tomato and peppers, given our subject this evening. And the reason it's important is because it allows for you to provide nitrogen all season long. Nitrogen as a nutrient can move in the environment. It can be washed away with water, either as a runoff or as leaching into the soil away from the plants. So we don't put 100% down of what that plant needs. That 4/10 of a pound is not quite sufficient. So what we can actually do, and this is a rate chart based on 100-foot rows, you can see, for instance, with tomatoes, if we wanted to use calcium nitrate, and that's a good choice for both peppers and tomatoes, we could use 1.5 pounds per 100-foot row. So depending on the size of your rows, you would adjust that number up or down. And certainly there are other nitrogen containing fertilizers, and you can see those listed, such as blood meal or feather meal, as well as some other options such as soybean, cottonseed meal, or even fish-based fertilizers. You will note that for tomato and pepper, uh, the timing that we typically would do this is when we start having those first fruits, the first tomatoes and peppers that are about 1 inch in diameter. Now, obviously, with both plants, we have some things that are not quite ever going to reach. I can think of grape tomatoes, or some of our smaller peppers are never going to actually reach that 1 inch diameter. So basically, when things are maybe about a quarter of the way of their final size, would be appropriate timing for some of those smaller fruited plants. So just be aware of that little detail for those varieties. And you'll also see there that this chart does not talk about using ammonium nitrate or urea as a source of this nitrogen, unless we're looking at late season application to peppers. And the reason we do that is because of some conflicts that those forms of nitrogen can actually cause with other nutrients. And so we will talk about that a little bit later. So tomatoes briefly, and if you joined us for the, I believe it was the uh, breakfast, I think, webinar that we did, the breakfast garden. Some of this is a little bit repetitive, but I did try to add additional details and change some things up. One thing that's really a sore spot with me, I guess, is very often now when you go into the garden centers, you find that when they're selling tomato transplants, they are very large plants. And so that also translates to a higher cost. Let me just be very clear, you don't need a large transplant to be successful with tomatoes, or really with any of our vegetables. In fact, younger transplants, smaller transplants, typically are faster growing, and they actually establish better when we go to transplant them. So I encourage you, certainly you can choose a larger transplant if you would like, but it's not a necessity for success. So you can still find out in the market 6-pack or 4-pack tomatoes like I have depicted here. Very good size for placing out in the garden. They'll establish quickly, grow rapidly, and are great. One thing about tomatoes that's very unique, pretty much any other plant that we're growing in the garden, not just the vegetable garden, but even ornamentals, we always say we want to take care to plant it when we're transplanting it at the same depth it was originally growing. And so that means we would never bury them deeper than what they are growing. However, with tomatoes, we can actually bury them deeper. So if we were to do that, we would want to remove the leaves that would be below the surface of the ground. I have seen some advice online where people talk about using post hole diggers to dig the hole. I think that's going maybe a bit overboard. I certainly would never advise you to go over 10 inches deep. And the reason is roots need oxygen. So while that stem has the capability of sprouting new roots, the further down you go, the less oxygen there is available to them. So the less likely they're going to play a significant role. In fact, within the landscape of plants, really the top 10 inches typically will contain 90% of the roots of most any plant. So you don't have to go extremely deep whenever you plant these. Sometimes you have tall or long plants. Maybe you had to hold them in a little bit longer than you expected if you were raising your own. And one of the things you can do with this instead of digging deeply is actually lay them horizontally. So those stems can actually be buried horizontally and you get the same effect of burying that stem length and creating more roots for that plant. I always encourage folks to take consideration of staking or caging your tomato plants. It really helps to hold them up off the ground and can reduce some early fruit loss that we have whenever that tomato fruit is in contact with the soil or even mulch. So certainly staging or caging can certainly be a good practice and help us out with our production. We do want to pay a little bit of attention to spacing because we do have two large categories of tomatoes. Those would be determinate and indeterminate. Determinate are also sometimes referred to as bush tomatoes within the industry. And what these actually grow to about 3 feet tall or so, and then they stop growing. And so they have good production, but it's concentrated in a more narrow window than the alternative, which are indeterminate tomatoes. These basically keep growing once we plant them out in the garden up until frost, essentially. And so, because of that, they actually do have higher productive capacity, but it's spread over a longer window of harvest. So, each of them have their good points and their bad points, and certainly they're both welcome in everyone's garden. The thing to understand about indeterminates is if you've ever planted tomatoes and then as you get towards the end of the season, the row middles disappear and it looks like one big jungle, you were probably growing indeterminate. So sometimes we can get crowded with indeterminate tomatoes. So be aware of that. You'll notice the spacing is more than for the determinate or bush type tomatoes, and that's because of their growing habits. So certainly both have a place, but just understand that indeterminate tomatoes do take a little more space in our garden. Peppers are a plant that, unlike tomatoes, we're going to plant them at the same depth they're growing as transplants. Not always thought of, but I think caging or staking peppers can also be beneficial. Very often we can have peppers low hanging on the plant, and certainly giving them some support can help prevent some issues there. One thing that sometimes people will ask or think happens is that they're growing both hot and sweet peppers in the garden, and they think that hot and sweet peppers are crossing in their garden. The fruit that we harvest this year, its characteristic is determined by the seed we planted. So if you plant something that's supposed to be sweet and it turns out to be hot, it's not because of what happened this season with pollination. It's actually what happened last season with pollination when that seed was created. So yes, they will cross in the garden, but the fruit themselves don't change. It's the seed is going to tell us what that fruit is. So be aware that you can plant hot peppers and sweet peppers in the same garden, and as long as you're not saving any seed, there's absolutely no concern about them changing each other. We can grow peppers in containers as well as tomatoes. And one thing to be aware of is, generally speaking, the smaller fruited peppers are also smaller plants. So things like bell peppers and poblanos, which have larger plants, are less suited to containers than some of our other types. Doesn't mean we can't grow them, but for most peppers, a 5 gallon bucket would be appropriate to grow them in. For bell peppers and poblanos, you probably ideally would like to have something a little bit larger just because those plants can be quite large. So, certainly, container growing is an option for peppers as well as tomatoes. One thing I want to spend a little bit of time with, just because it's something that commonly is brought to my attention with questions from folks, is blossom end rot. So, blossom end rot is quite literally the lack of calcium in the fruits. Typically, we see it as sunken areas at the blossom end of tomatoes or peppers, and it actually can also pop up on cucumbers and squashes. So, calcium lacking in plants is a significant problem for vegetable production, and the reason is calcium basically glues cell layers together. That's a complete oversimplification, but it's how I think of it. And so that's why we get these depressed areas, sunken areas, and it typically is on that blossom end, which is the growing point of that fruit. And so often, as you see kind of depicted, especially in the red tomato picture, there'll be a secondary fungus or something that comes in there and starts to decay. So oftentimes we have more than one thing happening. Peppers, it's often that it appears more kind of on the side, has to do with how it distorts that growing point, and often will get premature coloring. So typically a bell pepper that's going to reach color such as yellow, it have to be very mature, but part of the influence of this lack of calcium and the negative effects of it is it ages portions of that fruit prematurely. So that's why we get that mature color that oftentimes we wouldn't ordinarily see in those peppers at that age. It is rarely, though, a lack of calcium in the soils. So it is a lack of calcium in the fruit itself, but it's rarely a lack of calcium in the soils. So what does that mean for us? So, what I want us to think about for a couple of minutes is calcium in plants. And the first question I want to address is, how does calcium get into plants in the first place? So, calcium moves with water. You'll sometimes see it referred to as a mass flow nutrient. And so it travels into the xylem system of that plant with the water. And so it's something that, as long as that plant's moving water, it's moving calcium. And so we know that the leaves are transpiring water. It's one way they keep cool. So water is actually leaving those leaves and cooling it through the evapotranspiration. And as it's renewing that, as it's sucking in more water, bringing in more water into the plant, it's bringing in calcium. And what's important to realize is a big driver of where the water goes is where the water is being lost. And fruit itself actually doesn't lose a lot of water. If we think about it, when you think of how juicy tomatoes are, for instance, it's pretty straightforward that they have those outer layers that help maintain water. They don't lose water quickly. So certainly a lot of water goes through the leaves, less so through the fruit. And so the challenge is, if we have periods where we're not getting a lot of water into that plant at all, there may be very little actually going to that fruit. And by extension, maybe very little calcium is going to that fruit. And that sets up that deficiency there in those growing points of that fruit. So, what forms of calcium do plants use? Well, we need to understand that plants take in ions, and so basically dissolved calcium ions. And we also need to be aware that within ions, there's competition between them. So we can see that calcium has a +2 charge, and so it's in competition with other positively charged ions. I mentioned this earlier in one of the slides, but one of the number one things we can do to fix blossom end rot is watering more evenly or more regularly. We want even soil moisture. And so what that means is we don't want wet and dry periods, because what happens is if we have wet and dry periods, we actually have kind of jumps or spurts of growth that those plants experience, and then more slow times. And so if they aren't regularly bringing calcium into that plant where there's an even flow because of available water, we get in a situation where there isn't calcium available in that fruit. So there's a few things we can do to get this more even soil moisture. One of those is watering as needed. And this does change with the growth of the plant. We're going to be watering more frequently and certainly more volume, but also temperature. So when we have those hot, sunny days, they're going to be using more water than on days that aren't quite as hot. So one of the things I encourage people to do is water deeply, and to water as needed. So, it's much better to water twice a week very deeply, because as we water deeply, we encourage those roots to grow more, because roots will seek out water in the soil profile. And if all we ever do is wet the very top of the soil, that's where those roots are going to stay, because they're getting water they need there. So if we water every day very lightly, we're encouraging to have a very small root system, which can create other problems. But certainly watering regularly a couple of times a week and deeply encourage a larger root growth and a larger root system, which means more area to draw that water from. Using mulches is great in the garden for a number of reasons. In this particular instance, what mulches do is help preserve moisture in part by lowering soil temperature. So they do shade that soil and they help retain the moisture that we do apply through irrigation or that happens because of precipitation. And another thing that's important is we're not going to look at adding calcium because unless we have a action based on a soil test result, it's unlikely that we have a soil that's actually deficient in calcium in our region. We typically have abundant soil calcium for our plants, and so it's very rarely that we would see any sort of deficiency in our area. If you start looking online or on social media, wherever you might look, you will find a lot of remedies for blossom end rot. And so I thought I'd pull out at least some of those and address them on why they kind of miss the mark. So calcium foliar sprays. So calcium foliar sprays will get calcium into the leaves of that plant. But what's important to remember is where is calcium moving in that plant? It's moving in the xylem, in the water transport system. There isn't a linkage for that water transport system directly between the leaves and that fruit. In fact, there is a linkage through the phloem system, but the phloem system doesn't carry calcium. So just because we can put more calcium in the leaves doesn't actually mean it's going to get to that fruit, because again, calcium is being moved by that water in the plant. Another commonly referred to solution is Epsom salt. So Epsom salt is actually magnesium sulfate. And so whenever we put it in water and it dissolves in the soil into the water that's there, what we end up with is magnesium ions. And as you see there, magnesium ions are also a +2 charge. And so that means they're actually in direct competition with calcium ions with that same charge. And so basically, if you kind of think about it like shelves, there's only so many slots that are available. And if we're pumping in a lot of magnesium into that soil, we're going to actually start displacing some of those calcium ions. So we can actually make conditions locally worse in our soils if we're putting excess magnesium there. Certainly, magnesium is something that's needed for plant growth, and you can have a magnesium deficiency in plants. But if we don't have that deficiency and we're putting excess magnesium into our soil, we can actually be reducing the amount of calcium that's available to that plant and thus making blossom end rot worse. So we would never say let's apply Epsom salt to solve blossom end rot. And what about some of the other things? So one of the big ones, and there's a number of different products that people suggest you apply to the soil or maybe spray on the plant even. Some of these I've seen that recommendation, but it's everything from powdered milk or egg shells or oyster shells, even antacids, such as, Tums or Rolaids. And the concept at least has a little bit of validity to it in as much as all these products have calcium in various forms. And so, in theory, we're adding calcium to the soil. But again, it's missing the larger issue. It's not so much there's a lack of calcium in the soil, it's is calcium getting to that developed fruit. So, none of these actually solve that problem. They may help in the instance of a soil deficiency. But again, in our region, it's going to be uncommon that we have a true soil deficiency. And the other thing I want to bring up, none of these are actually directly applying ions. I don't believe that the antacids will dissolve in water and create ions, certainly not eggshells and certainly not powdered milk. And what I mean by that, all these have to be acted upon somehow within the soil, whether through chemistry or biological processes, before that calcium ion is actually available to the plant. So if we were in a situation where we needed to add calcium to the soil, we have better options in the fertilizer world that actually are going to be more efficient as to how quickly calcium becomes available to that plant. So although these in theory are adding calcium, typically it's not the problem. And even if that were the problem, we probably have better solutions available to us. And sometimes people will ask about applying lime because they're aware that most liming materials contain calcium in one form or another. And it's actually a pretty valid question, because if you look at the research associated with pH and nutrient availability, it is true that very acid soils will limit the availability of calcium. However, there's also another wrinkle. If we have soils that are too alkaline or too high of a pH, we can actually create availability issues in relationship to calcium, because it starts forming precipitates with phosphorus at more alkaline conditions. So basically, there's a range where pH is good. If we move out of that range, we create additional problems. And so this is why we would never encourage anyone to apply lime to their vegetable garden, to their lawn, without first doing a soil test, because lime changes the pH of the soil. It's not a nutrient itself, but it changes the availability of nutrients. And so if we get outside of the envelope that's good, then we have issues. So never use lime to solve a problem. Use it to solve a pH issue, and use it as directed by a soil test. So what's the best answer for blossom end rot when it comes to tomatoes and peppers? Even soil moisture. So by watering deeply and infrequently, and using mulches to reduce the soil temperature and reduce water loss, what we're doing is creating a constant even flow of calcium moving into that plant, and then that will actually allow for those fruit to have the calcium they need to complete their growth, and so we don't get those symptoms of blossom end rot. And so with that, I will pause for questions. Let me stop my share. And certainly, if you have questions, reach out to me. I'll drop my email into the chat box in just a moment if you didn't catch it on the screen, and we can go from there. But okay, we have a great question. Where can we get our soil tested? So one of the best places, although it's probably biased, is through our office. So we charge $20. It's $15 for the soil test itself by the soil lab that gets shipped off to UT Soil Lab, and we charge $5 shipping for that. If you ship one alone, I promise you it will cost more than $5 to ship it. And so we're able to typically, hopefully, bundle those together, and we're able to break even on that. Certainly, there are private labs that will do soil testing as well. Those are valid. What I don't feel are valid is the home test kits. I don't think those have the rigor associated with them that we would need for something like chemical analysis. So I typically would encourage you not to do any sort of home test kit where you are looking at strips or different solutions. Instead, send it off to a professional lab. And that's the only one I see. And I see that Elizabeth actually answered that too. So thank you. Natural remedy prevent tomato worms, those big, ugly green worms. Well, there really isn't a natural remedy per se. There's a couple of options. So those are the larva stage of a caterpillar. So a product like BT, or Bacillus thuringiensis, works on them. It works best when they're young. So it is something that typically once you see them, BT is less effective. Certainly there's a host of conventional insecticides that would work on them, that would work well. There are some natural predators that will parasitize those caterpillars as well. So if you ever see the little white things on those big green caterpillars, don't kill those caterpillars, because those are the cocoons of a parasitoid wasp. So just a straight out natural remedy, I would say there is not one for that. And I'm going to drop my email in there. And certainly, if you have questions on this topic or any others related to your garden, please feel free to reach out to me. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Elizabeth.
All right, thank you, Adam. Yeah, so if you've got any other questions that come up during my presentation, just feel free to drop those in the chat box, and we will try to answer those afterwards. And of course, I'll share my email and contact information with you all. So I'm just going to give y'all some fun facts about salsa, and then also do a quick demonstration for you all on salsa that is very common, that you will find actually back in the Southwest in New Mexico, where I am originally from. So Some fun facts about salsa is May is National Salsa Month. Okay, so this is a good way to kind of end the month in our garden series. But salsa can actually be tracked back to Aztecs, Mayans, and Incas. And it's actually, salsa is in Spanish and Italian actually means sauce. Okay, so it's a combination of different peppers and other ingredients. So commonly you're going to find with salsa made with tomatoes. You'll also find that they could be made with tomatillos. So a lot of people like them, mango type salsas, or some kind of fruit type salsa. And so it's also very popular. It's up there with ketchup, mustard, and mayonnaise. And actually, it was named by Christopher Columbus because he mistakenly called the chili pod pepper, thinking that it was actually related to black pepper. So a little bit of nutrition about it. One fresh medium green chili pod has as much vitamin C as 6 oranges. 1 teaspoon of red chili powder has the daily requirements for vitamin A. You will find chili peppers as part of a treatment for sore throat. You can find them in teas and lozenges for your throat. Capsaicinoids is used in muscle patches for sore and aching muscles. And you'll actually find the oleoresin in lipsticks and also in processed meats. Now, so how do they determine how hot a chili pepper is? And they actually use the Scoville test, okay? And it's actually the first lab test to measure the heat in chili peppers. And it's a series of prepared chili samples that are made and tested by human subjects. And so the samples are actually diluted till they're no longer detected. And a single unit of dilution is called the Scoville heat unit. And so you will see that pure capsaicin is 15 million Scovilles. So they had to basically dilute that 15 million times to where it wasn't tested at all, or you couldn't taste it at all in that sample. And so you'll see that the Carolina Reaper is 1.4 million to 2.2 million Scoville units. And so there's also, and you can see there's several different types of chili peppers. And so you'll see down here the most common, like the jalapeno, is 2,500 to 8,000. The poblano is 1,000 to 1,500. A bell pepper is actually 0. And this is actually more accurate than taste testing it, which is the bite the chili technique. It's also less expensive. There are a few other ways to test those. And then also some cons of doing this type of test is it's based on the taster's palate and their sensitivity to the chemical compounds that are responsible for heat. So there's only so much that a taster can handle in a reasonable amount of time. So imagine having to taste the Carolina Reaper or the Trinidad Scorpion or the Ghost Pepper and that type of thing. So you can see that there's a lot hotter type of peppers that people like to consume. Of course, I will stop my share here, and I will transfer over to my kitchen area. So I will show you all how to prepare some salsa. Turning my video off here for a minute so I can move over here. But is there any questions so far?
I am not seeing any in the chat.
Okay. I'm gonna go ahead and wash my hands really quick. Now, anytime that you mess with chili peppers, it's always very important to make sure that you wash your hands, and then I'll turn my video back on so you can kind of see this over here. So I've actually prepared a lot of different, I've already prepared a lot of this already, just because the roasting part of this takes a little bit of time. So roasting your vegetable ingredients, you can see that I've roasted my tomatoes here. I've roasted the jalapenos. I've also have roasted one of these. And so back home in New Mexico, we refer to these as green chilies. Most of the time you're going to find them, you're going to hear them as Anaheim chilies. Some people refer to them as Big Johns. So these are actually green chili. And so with a green chili, you know that it's from New Mexico if it has New Mexico style green chili, and or if it says Hatch green chili. So Hatch is actually a location where green chilies are grown in New Mexico. And in order to be called Hatch green chilies, they actually have to come from that area. So I've roasted my tomatoes, I've roasted my onion, and I've also roasted, like I said, that green chili here. But your tomatoes, you can see I'm actually using Roma tomatoes here, and that's because they have a little bit more meat to them. All right, so basically we're roasting them. I roasted them on the stove, and I'm actually going to take out the core, okay? So I'm gonna take this out. Just don't want that part in there, okay? And then I'm gonna go ahead and I'm going to put my tomatoes in my blender. So you'll need a blender. Now, if you're wanting more of like pico de gallo, you don't have to roast these. You can actually leave it fresh. So I'm gonna come over here and you'll see that my blender is not very large. So I have to do this, if I can get this on here, in batches, okay? I'm gonna start off with my tomatoes here. Okay. And I left the skin on it. So I'm gonna take this off and bring it back over here so you all can kind of see. And what I said in the handout that you'll receive is you want it to look like applesauce almost. So I'm gonna pour some of this out into a bowl. I'm gonna leave some of the tomato in there because I am going to go ahead and I'm gonna add my onion in here. Okay. And don't worry, this is not hot. They've kind of cooled down a little bit. But you're looking for that roasting. You can also roast in your oven under the broiler, and or you can roast it using a grill. Okay. So the next thing that I'm going to do is because I'm about to touch some peppers. And if you saw some of the other videos that we've done, it's important anytime you mess with peppers, especially if they have some heat to them, is to wear gloves. I've done it where I forgot and I've cut up peppers and I've actually touched my eyes and it's not fun at all. Okay. So what I did is I topped it off. Okay. And then I'm actually just going to kind of roughly cut this and I'm going to throw the whole thing in here. And I'm actually going to do 2 jalapenos. You can do 1 jalapeno at a time or half a jalapeno at a time until you know for sure if that's going to be a hot pepper or not. Because I know a lot of people, if you're not used to hot peppers, they can be not fun to eat. So it's hard to sometimes bring down that heat. So the green chili, typically we'll open it up and we have our seeds in here, and you can leave the seeds or you can take them out. I'm just going to take out some of them. Okay. And I'm just going to kind of roughly slice this up just to make it little smaller pieces. I'm going to throw it in here. Okay. And then what I'm going to do next is wipe off some of this juice here. is for fresh or roasted salsa. You want to use a lime. You can use lime or you can use vinegar, and you actually want to juice the lime. Okay. So a good way for limes, you can also use lemon, like a lemon or vinegar, is just roll it on your cutting board, and that's to kind of help release some of those juices, so it's a little bit easier to juice. And I'm going to slice it in half. Okay, and then you can either squeeze it in there or you can use your juicer. I'm using the juicer just to keep any seeds from winding up in there. So I use about 1 lime. If you're a fan of lime, you can use more than 1. You can use 2 or 3, and depending on how much you make of this. Okay. So I've juiced it, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pour that in here. Gives it a little bit of that sour taste. Okay. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take some of my cilantro here, and I'm just going to put it in with the peppers. Now, some people don't like cilantro, and that's because to many people it tastes like soap. All right. And that's common for that to happen. But it's one that you will find in a lot of salsa recipes. And then finally, I'm going to add some salt here. Okay. And salt is like for taste, and you can also add cumin if you choose to, which that is common too. And so I'm going to take this over here, and I'm going to blend it up again. Okay. So we've got that applesauce looking texture. Some of that cilantro, I might have to do it again. I'm going to go ahead and do that real quick again. Some of it got stuck up on top. And then I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to pour it in here with my tomatoes. Okay. And I am just going to mix it up. Okay. And it's okay if you see some of that roasting in there. All right. And then at this point, you just taste it. And if you need to add more peppers to it, you can add more peppers. If you need to add more lime juice or lemon juice or vinegar to it, you can do that also. And then one other thing, of course, is adding garlic to that. So I may need to do that real quick. So our garlic cloves here, I've got 1. You can add a couple of them, but this is a fresh one, so it still has some of that skin on there. So you want to go ahead and you want to put your knife on top of there. Okay, move that over. You want to put it on top of the clove. Make sure that the sharp end is away from you, the blunt end is towards you. You want to have it on top of there and just take your fist and pound it down, and it will break up some of that. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and blend this up too. Again, I might add a little bit extra in there just to have that so it's easier to blend. Got a couple of cloves here. Okay, so it's easier to take that skin off. So it peels off fairly easy. Add a little bit of this back in here, and I'm going to blend it up again, just so I have that garlic flavor to this. Now you can also buy the garlic in store and use it that way. If there is somebody at the farmer's market that grows their own garlic, that's a good option too. Purchase it there. But we'll go ahead and mix this back in here, and we have our salsa to enjoy with chips, nachos, tacos, any of that. My dad loves salsa, fresh salsa with his eggs. So that is an option too. And I'm going to stop my video and move on back over. Is there any questions?
There was one question. Do you ever taste the hot pepper before adding it so you know how hot it is before you add it?
That is an option if you want to taste it before you put it in there. Now, if you add it in there before tasting it and not knowing, it is very, you can add more tomatoes. You can add more onion to it to kind of help break up that too. One thing that we do, if you do eat something hot, is actually drink milk. And that will actually help break up the hotness of the chili peppers. And my blender was quiet. It was kind of loud on my end. But one thing that I was going to share with you, I was telling Adam about this before, is there's actually, so where I received my undergraduate was at New Mexico State, and they actually have a chili pepper institute. And so this is where they do a lot of the testing for chili peppers. And so you can actually visit their website, cpi.nmsu.edu, and anything and everything that you want to know about chili peppers, this is the place to get it. And so they actually are the ones that do the Scoville testing on the different chili peppers there. The other thing that I wanted to bring your attention to is actually, I'm just going to put in a plug here, is if you are interested in learning how to can, we are offering a canning college this summer. It's a hands-on experience. I'm partnering with Unicoi County to offer this. But the first one is actually going to be held here in Washington County at the Farm Bureau building. And you'll see the dates, June 17th, the 24th of June, and then July 1st is the first canning college. And the second one will be held in Unicoi, Tennessee at the Buffalo Kitchen. And that one is July 8th, 15th, and 22nd. Both are from 6 to 9. And so the fee is $100. I know Adam said there was a lot of individuals that he gets that has questions about wanting to learn how to can. So I'm just going to put in that plug here for that. And then finally, I will go back and share my contact information. I will share the recipe that I did tonight, this evening. It's actually my own personal recipe that I use. So you'll receive that, and you'll receive a copy of the Canning College sign up registration form. But of course, if you need to get a hold of me, you can contact me at our office number here, 423-753-1680. And that's also where Adam is housed at. So you can call that office and ask for either one of us. There's my email address. Of course, you can visit our website, Facebook and YouTube also. And then if you can, please complete the survey. You will get a follow-up email here shortly after the class with the different resources, and then also that link to the Salsa Garden survey. I'll go ahead and stop my share. Is there any other questions? So somebody said last year our Anaheim peppers got hotter as the season went on, started off super mild and ended up very hot. Is that normal change? Yes. Where green chilies are normally grown is very hot. It is a very dry climate. And so they found that the more stressed the plant is, the hotter it gets. So that's why a lot of New Mexico green chili is very hot, because it's in a lot of very stressful state. So yeah, that's probably why it got hot, is because it was stressed. And Adam's shaking his head.
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. A lot of plant-based chemicals are responsive to environmental stressors, and so you will see differences depending on the time of year or how good or poorly even something may be cared for.
Mhm. Yeah, and Anaheim peppers, if y'all want to know, their harvesting season is end of August into September and October. And they are best when they are roasted. So if you do decide to grow any Anaheims, your best flavor that you're going to get is when you roast them. So typically when I do mine, if I'm here, I will roast them on the grill outside, and it'll bring out a different flavor and smell that you have not ever experienced before. um, but thank you all for joining us this evening. We hope, like I said earlier, we hope that we'll be able to do this again, maybe next season, next spring, maybe a couple in the fall. But of course, if you have any questions, just feel free to reach out to us and we will try to help you all.